Hi, this is Kevin Baumer, CML Executive Director, and welcome to this week's edition of the CML Statehouse Report. I'm going to jump right into it. First and primary issue for CML right now in the employment area is Senate Bill 188. This is the Family Medical Leave Insurance Bill. It was heard this morning in Senate Appropriations. There's a lot of concern about fiscal note. Significant amendments were made to the bill earlier in the week, and suffice to say that there are still a lot of issues and concerns with the legislation. The bill was laid over until Tuesday in the Senate Appropriations Committee. If it passes, it'll go to the floor. We would expect a full and robust debate. But some major concerns with this legislation: it's wage replacement intended to look like the Family Medical Leave Act, but paid wage replacement, paid for through a premium coming from payroll deduction. And that is good except to the extent that employers would be mandated to participate. Doesn't align very well when you have, particularly municipal employers, with paid time off benefits and leave benefits that are better than what would be provided in the Family Medical Leave Insurance Bill, and would actually, since it would be very unlikely that employers could afford to keep both, require ultimately employers to be forced to get rid of the better benefits so that employees could have a less generous benefit, all for a very small utilization according to the proponents. So a situation where you've got a statewide universal coverage that will be paid for by all, but only have a handful of folks, a small percentage of employees that would actually utilize, is extraordinarily problematic. There's functional issues with the legislation. It still doesn't align with the FMLA, which means employers would be in a position of either complying with federal law or complying with state law, but probably not able to comply with both. Would result in stacking of benefits and other issues that have not been fully resolved in the legislation. There's concerns about whether or not the plan itself could be actuarially sound. There's been some sideboards that have been put in place in terms of amendments, but we could be a couple years away before you even know if the thing would be sound. There are definitional issues that don't align with FMLA. Basically, it's creating potentially a significant burden where municipal employers are already providing benefits for their employees. So we're still opposed to the bill, and it has a long ways to go. I know the proponents continue to meet with folks and want to talk about the issues, but there's really not been a lot of movement in meeting the employer concerns that have been raised. They've been addressed, but not necessarily in a manner that solves the problems. Sort of a long-winded explanation on that one today, but it's one of the significant issues left in the legislative session. I want folks to pay attention to it because it will affect not only municipal employers and employees, but all the businesses in the community as well. And that's Senate Bill 188. Stay tuned for more on that next week. And I'll mention on local government minimum wage, we continue to participate in conversations that would place additional restrictions, guardrails, and sideboards potentially. The sponsors have asked about a few ideas, as has the governor's office. All of this, I think, is still in the realm of local government minimum wage may be allowed, but in a constrained way. The league doesn't have any objections to guardrails and has, in fact, participated in advocating for some. That bill will be heard for action finally next week on Monday. There's been some hemp legislation. This has been an area where we've got a lot of inquiries, but because of essentially the federal farm bill finally opening the door to allowing hemp regulation, it has to be done really with what the state allows because of the federal nature of it. And in that sense, we have legislation that has been introduced, that Senate Bill 220 dealing with the cultivation side of it. It means working with the Department of Ag once the bill passes over establishing appropriate local regulations and licensing perhaps of cultivation sites, but that's a longer term prospect. A shorter term prospect may be legislation that is not yet introduced that would allow municipalities to have clear authority on business licensing of processing facilities, something that is desperately needed, and we hope to be able to see that come to fruition with what's left of the session. Last but not least, I'll mention marijuana. The delivery and hospitality establishment bills, 1234 and 1230 respectively, are continuing to move through the process, and we're neutral on those. We dropped our opposition with amendments. However, I will note that the legislation that is known as the Retail Marijuana Sunset Bill essentially repeals and reenacts the entire marijuana code with changes, and some of those changes we saw with amendment in committee this week. The bill is Senate Bill 224, and there are two significant things, but a lot more in a very large bill that we're looking at. One, some of you may recall my great adventure a couple of years ago trying to get a simple definition of open and public consumption in the statute. It was a 120-day ordeal that on the 120th day we saw legislation that the league initiated die. That definition, or something very close to it, has now been inserted into Senate Bill 224. So that's a good thing, and we hope that sticks. A clear statewide definition of what open and public consumption is very important. But there are other things in there, like a new license type called accelerator licenses. I'll spare the explanation. It needs a lot of scrutiny. We've got to make sure nothing slips in what is a very large bill. That's all I have to talk about this week.
Hello, Morgan Cullen here. Another busy week at the Capitol. A couple of bills that have continued to move forward that I've been working on. The first is House Bill 1221. That has to do with the regulation of e-scooters. Right now, scooters are regulated or classified as toys under state statute. And this bill would treat them more like e-bikes and provide a broad regulatory framework so that municipalities have the flexibility to really be able to deal with them appropriately on their city streets. That bill passed out of the Senate Transportation and Energy Committee yesterday and was actually put on the consent calendar after a unanimous vote. So it's already in its second chamber, and that bill will just continue to move forward probably next week before it hits the governor's desk. So I probably won't be bringing that bill up again. And then also House Bill 1239. This is a bill I've been working on that would create a 7-member committee that would oversee appropriations to assist local governments, nonprofits, and other groups in doing outreach before the 2020 decennial census. Decennial census is very important because a lot of federal appropriations are tied directly to the census count. So even just a 1% undercount can cost hundreds of millions of dollars for Colorado here over the ensuing decade. So the bill passed on third reading in the House and now is headed over to the Senate. However, the original $12 million appropriation that was allocated was cut in half, so now there's $6 million. And that's really just due to the lower expectations that came out of the state revenue forecast several weeks ago. So, but that bill is headed over to the Senate now, and we expect to see it continue to move forward. Also, several new bills have been introduced over the past week. The first one is Transportation Funding Bill, SCR 19-003. This bill would be a referred measure for voters to consider during the 2020 election cycle. And it would replace the gas tax with an equivalent sales tax. The idea behind it is that the gas tax, the 22-cent a gallon gas tax, really does not adjust for inflation over a period of time. And so there's it really is a depreciating revenue source. This bill would transition over to a sales tax. As commodity prices increase, so does the total amount of sales tax that are collected on specific purchases. So it does increase. CML is kind of lukewarm, I guess, on this bill, and we're really just taking a monitor position. It's interesting. We did support Proposition 110 last fall, but this bill doesn't have anywhere near the new revenue projections that Proposition 110 would have provided. $21 billion over a 20-year period. this bill really is kind of a wash as far as new revenue is concerned. And then it uses the state sales tax to help fund transportation costs, which makes it more difficult since sales tax revenue is a key component and revenue source for local governments across the state. So we'll continue to monitor that bill going forward. There were several new bills that were introduced over the past week. The first is SCR 19-003, and this is a transportation infrastructure funding bill that would replace the existing 22-cent a gallon gas tax with a sales tax, with an equivalent sales tax rate. CML is continuing to monitor this bill, but it doesn't provide nearly the amount of revenue that, for example, a Proposition 110 would have generated over a 21-year period, that being $21 billion. This is really a wash. It's replacing the gas tax with the sales tax with very limited new revenue coming in. So we'll continue to see where that bill goes forward, but it would be a referred measure for voters to consider in 2020. Another bill is House Bill 1313, which is a piece of legislation that's been brought forward by Xcel Energy that would amend the current renewable energy statute and create a broad regulatory framework for how regulated utilities over 500,000 with over 500,000 customers are treated by the PUC, and it really kind of is just a continuation of legislation that was brought forward through an announcement last fall that Xcel Energy made as far as their carbon reduction goals are concerned, which was 80% 80% reduction of carbon greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 below 2005 levels. And then a 100% reduction by 2050. So that bill was just recently introduced, but I believe it will be up in committee next week. And then we also have House Bill 314, which has to do with a just transition from coal-based electric utility generation. And this bill creates the Just Transition Office within the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, and then also requires a utility that's interested in closing a conventional coal generating power plant and replacing it with renewable energy. The whole idea behind this bill is to provide a smooth transition for local economies and for local governments and workers that are economically impacted by the closure of these specific plants. So we will also be watching that bill closely as it moves forward through the process. And one more transportation item to get you updated on. If you may recall, last week the House Chamber took up Senate Bill 207, which is the long bill. A deal was struck with the House Republicans to provide an additional $100 million in transportation infrastructure funding for this fiscal year. That bill essentially will go to conference committee, which is essentially the joint budget committee, and they're going to have to decide where that money is going to come from and how that money will be spent. But CML has a great idea about how that money should be allocated, and that's essentially just running the money through the HUTF formula. That way 60% of the money will go to the state, to CDOT, to fund state infrastructure projects, but the remaining 40 will be split evenly between counties and municipalities, 20/20, and would provide additional money for local infrastructure projects. It would also provide a good equitable stream of money that would be allocated to every area of the state, not just to big interstate infrastructure projects. So we think that's a very good, equitable way to move forward for funding this money, and it could essentially just be added to the additional $150 million that's going to be allocated in a similar fashion under Senate Bill 1 for this year. So we'll see where that goes. It's not even close to a foregone conclusion how that money is going to be spent yet, but CML will continue to keep you apprised on what's going on, and we will be continuing to work hard on behalf of municipalities to make sure that we get our fair share.
Hi, this is Brandy DeLange with the Colorado Municipal League. I have 3 updates for this week, so let's get started. First bill is House Bill 1035. We can officially say this bill has been signed by the governor. He signed it today, and if you recall, this is our electrical inspection fee, and the bill that CML and CCI worked jointly on, creating a base fee of $120, an 8% multiplier, and then allowing the fee to track with inflation throughout the years annually, I should say. The next bill to cover today is Senate Bill 107. This is our broadband easement bill. If you recall from last week, CML was provided with a strike below from the bill sponsor, and we let folks know that municipal utilities had been eliminated from the bill. What this really means is that the bill no longer harms, nor does it help municipal utilities or local governments looking to quote unquote perfect their easements for broadband infrastructure and broadband networks. So I think at this point we are just watching the bill as it makes its way through the process. We are scheduled to have the bill heard in committee on Monday, April 15th, and we'll continue to be engaged in the process. We're pretty certain that there will be more changes to the bill before it makes it to committee next Monday, so stay tuned for that. And then finally, the last bill that I want to provide folks with an update on is House Bill 1260. This is our energy code bill. This is the bill that CML worked with bill sponsors and proponents on, expanding the reporting years and updating years to the 3 most recent energy codes for when, and that's really important to know, when a local government is updating their building codes. So this means that there's not a mandatory time frame in which you update your building codes, but when you guys are ready, you will update to the 3 most recent years. We think that this will help lessen some of the burden on local governments and the costs associated, though very clearly we know that this will still be a challenge for our more rural and small communities out there. And just so folks are aware, we did share these concerns with committee members and with the bill sponsor as we let folks know that CML is now neutral based off of the changes to the bill.
Hi, this is Megan Dollar, Legislative and Policy Advocate with the Colorado Municipal League. I'm going to start out today talking about House Bill 1289. This bill actually has to do with the Consumer Protection Act and is a bill that's been brought by the Attorney General. Where CML kind of came in is we noticed that there was language in the bill that had to do with standard form contracts, language that we felt would undo a number of construction defect reforms that we've worked to achieve over the past few years. Some of you may recall that CML was part of a larger coalition to seek construction defect reform in Colorado with the end goal of gaining more attainable housing, particularly owner-occupied attached housing within municipalities. So there was some concern that the standard form contract language contained within House Bill 1289 would actually negatively impact some of our progress. Mayor Adam Paul from the City of Lakewood came in and testified on behalf of the CML as well as other entities and talked about our concerns with the bill. Ultimately, the committee did actually remove that entire section of the bill around standard form contracts, and so CML did remove its opposition. There are 2 more pieces of legislation that have been introduced surrounding the opioid and substance abuse disorder conversation, 2 of which CML are supporting. The first one being House Bill 227. This bill focuses on the harm reduction aspect of substance abuse disorder, looking at preventing overdoses around Colorado, and it does a number of things. For our purposes, the big piece of the bill is that it creates a line item and a program within the Department of Human Services for a bulk purchasing program for the medication naloxone. Naloxone it reverses overdoses in individuals, and we've been a part of a group pushing to get as much of that out in the public as well, particularly through law enforcement and emergency service providers, and we believe that bulk purchasing program will do a great job of actually expanding that. The other piece of legislation that CML testified in support of was Senate Bill 228. This bill focuses on the prevention side of substance abuse disorders. It does that by creating a number of grant programs within the state to focus on all facets of substance abuse prevention. A few of those programs do have direct local impacts. One includes adding resources for local governments to do more grant writing to receive state and federal funding for substance abuse prevention programs, as well as a pilot program opportunity for local community to be able to determine management and prevention programs within their own communities. There's also a focus on public education when it comes to the proper disposal of opioid containers to prevent misuse. And finally, there is a piece in the bill that focuses on at-risk youth and preventing substance abuse in that community.
So that's all for this week. We'll see you next week on April 19th. And again, as things continue to happen, particularly if we have legislation where we need some immediate response to your House or Senate members, please stay tuned, watch out for action alerts. Things will be happening very quickly now that we're getting close to the last 20 days of the session.